but many are already aware of the existence of at least the symbolic factors with which we are to be concerned. The possible relationship between astronomy and religion has been so often discussed that nearly all Bible students, the students of comparative religion, are aware that such analogies or parallels do exist. We are interested, therefore, in determining, if possible, their validity and what they have contributed to our general knowledge of man's beliefs. Perhaps astrotheology would be a useful instrument as a common denominator of religions, for elements of it and traces of it are to be found throughout the world. In some way, for some reason, and the origins are obscure, these concepts unfolded together with man's religious and philosophical ideas and became almost universal. Now, how does this happen? The most obvious answer lies in the original unity of arts and sciences in the religious life of people. The first stargazers on their tall towers or ziggurats in the land of Babylon, these stargazers were astronomer priests. There was no differentiation between science and religion. We may say that almost certainly sciences were originally cultivated because of their religious content, or for the reason that they helped to support the religious convictions of the people. We know that the temples were the first colleges, and the ancient towers and palaces of the gods were the first astronomical observatories. There is a legend, which some of you may have run across, to the effect that the constellations were named by shepherds who, watching their flocks at night and with very little else to do, allowed their imaginations to trace the imageries by connecting stars into patterns in which some likenesses or appearances to various creatures could be traced. I think these shepherds were the shepherd priests or the shepherd kings of old times, the keepers of the sheepfold, which was the ancient name for the temple. In any event, many words that we use, many terms that we commonly find in our language, arise from the religious, astronomical reflections and contemplations of our ancestors. Actually, as one of the ancients observed, astronomy is the science of the anatomy of the universe. And to a measure, these same ancients believed that the universe was the body of a blessed God. Therefore, astronomy might be termed the anatomy and even the physiology of the body of the deity. This deity being represented as this God who is extended and distributed throughout the infinite diversity of his own parts and members. In any event, at a very remote time, men learned considerable about astronomy. It is quite likely that there have been cycles of remembrance and forgetfulness in this subject. A. Wallace Budge, keeper of the Egyptian and Assyrian Antiquities of the British Museum, declared that the Chaldean astronomers watched and measured and charted the motions of the heavens for more than 25,000 years. Now, of course, from a man of his standing, this is a rather unusual statement. And yet I'm certain that he felt that he could prove it. This tremendous amount of observation, even without the instruments that we know today, must have led to a variety of discoveries. We feel, for example, that ancient man was greatly limited in his astronomical researches by his lack of a telescope. Yet we also have record that the ancients knew certain things about the solar system in particular, which it seems impossible they could have known without some kind of a telescopic equipment. Perhaps the Chinese have the answer. On the wall of the city of Peking, there is the remain of an ancient observatory. It was partly reconstructed by the early Jesuits, but the instruments are essentially Chinese, and they have a complete observatory without a telescope. Now, what they did to meet this peculiar need was a masterpiece in optics. They discovered that by using a long, hollow tube without a lens, they could restrict the light of the sky and concentrate the energy going into their own eyes. And by means of these tubes without lenses, they were able to make a number of observations which would not normally be possible to the individual. They were able to give us a very clear understanding of many peculiar details. For instance, we find in other parts of the ancient world the full and obvious knowledge that the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Persians at an ancient time knew definitely that the planet Venus was never visible to us as a complete sphere, but most often like a minute lunar crescent. They also discovered in the field of Babylon the rings on Saturn, and the ancient deity of the Babylonians, corresponding to the deity Saturn, is always shown standing in the midst of rings which circle his body. These things are not just accidents. They tell us that at a long ago time, men made comparatively accurate observations of the world in which they lived. Pythagoras, writing or teaching about 600 years before the beginning of the Christian era, was one of the first to note that the planets in their chariots, the chariots of the gods, circle around the blazing altar of the sun. He is accredited generally with the first statement of the heliocentric system of astronomy as we know it today. How then have we forgotten all these things? The only answer is that in the waste of time, in the destruction of learned institutions, in the gradual decadence of the great temple mysteries, conquest, pillage, war, and destruction, many choice and valuable records were hopelessly destroyed, as in the case of the destruction of the great Serapean and Brocchian collections in Alexandria. Thus we dropped a dark curtain across history, having obliterated most of the early relics and records of man's intellectual life. We have every knowledge, then, that in the general and broad need of the world, ancient man was reasonably well equipped. He knew the earth was round. He was aware of the Western Hemisphere long before the beginning of the Christian era. And according to Plutarch, the historian, the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes area of the United States was explored by Grecian navigators at least 15 to 1800 years before its rediscovery at the time of Columbus. And of course, Columbus really was searching for a passage to Asia. He did not realize in the beginning that he had discovered a new continent. These ancient records and many legends and myths and fables all point out things that we should know, but which we have gently ignored. It is almost certain that the Chinese navigated the coast of California 2,500 years ago. And during the period of Genghis Khan, 12th, 13th century in Mongolia, the Chinese and Tatars were well aware of the Western Hemisphere. We have forgotten a great deal. And we have forgotten a great deal of the source of what we call existing knowledge, and the reason for it. And many things which we consider to be superstitions and legends really developed from a very astute observation of natural phenomena. One thing that ancient man had that we do not have is leisure. Now, the common man of his day, whether he was a builder of pyramids or an agriculturist, probably did not have much leisure. But there was a very broad, deep, scholarly class, particularly the priesthood, then the custodians of all knowledge, who not only had leisure, but an infinite kind of patience, which also runs short with us. This is the kind of patience which will permit a problem to be passed down through 20 generations without impatience. Observations and reflections were not carried on by small groups in a period of months, weeks, or even years, but became the projects of empires and of dynasties and of descents of families, so that one problem may have been labored over for 1,000 years, each generation, each century, bestowing its own fragment of further insight. Thus, by observation with great patience, man accomplished much. Another factor which had something to do with all this was man's dependency upon himself. Today we are no longer dependent upon the faculties and powers with which we were originally endowed. We have supplemented these powers and faculties by innumerable devices, depending more and more upon mechanistic substitution. We no longer need or call upon the resources of our own observational powers. Some years ago, an experiment was carried on one of the American Indian reservations, where it was demonstrated that a certain Indian of reasonable attainments, not a cultured man as we would term one, just a man who lived with his flock, watched them at night like the shepherds of old, and lived as our primordial ancestors lived, this man could distinctly hear a watch ticking in a man's pocket 65 feet away.